Armed with these concepts, we can reconstruct what Parmenides' argument is. And remember one thing he told us, look at that quote, the same thing is for thinking and for being. That is, anything that can be thought about can exist. One assumption he's making. And now, remember he said, look at that quote, that which is there to be spoken of and thought of must be, for it is impossible. This is the important thing. It is impossible for it to be, but not possible for nothing to be. The idea, I think, there is that anything that does not exist cannot exist. And from that premise, Parmenides wants us to draw the conclusion, therefore, anything that can exist does exist. Okay, now he's gotten possibility. Anything that it's possible that it exists does exist. Think about possibly existing. Pegasus, a winged horse, a mythical creature. It's possible it exists, right? It's possible that there are cows that can jump over the moon. I mean, there aren't any such things, but it's not a contradiction to think about it. But according to Parmenides, or the conclusion that he's gotten, is anything that can exist does exist. Okay, and it just comes from the premise above. Okay, so there's an interim conclusion, but now if you combine that conclusion from number 2, number 3, anything that can exist does exist, and anything that can be thought about can exist, it looks like it follows, therefore, that anything that can be thought about exists. And from that, we can see that the conclusion follows that, therefore, anything that does not exist cannot be thought about. Notice we now have all of the conclusions that Parmenides has been arguing for. Now you're scratching your head, saying, gee, weird stuff. May it sounded a little bit plausible. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. But let's take a look at it. And let's first remember we went over arguments. We learned a little bit about logic. And let me reconstruct this in a way. And one thing I should mention to you is, as you're listening to this, you probably want to have a copy of the slides printed out in front of you, or you might have to go back and forth between them, because if we look, and maybe I will do, if we look at it, I think we're going to find out that this argument is in fact valid. But let's take a look at it. So for the first premise I have is, remember, if a thing can be thought about, then it's possible for it to exist. And I just wanted to make it clear in terms of if X can be thought about, just any old thing X, then it is possible that X exists. The second premise, let's look under anything that does not exist, cannot exist. If X doesn't exist, then it's not possible that X exists. Therefore, it's possible that therefore, if it is possible that X exists, then X exists. And that's supposed to follow from 2. Then you got to go through this. This is going to be confusing. Have it printed out and go through it a few times. Therefore, if a thing can be thought about, then it exists. If X can be thought about, then it exists. Now that supposedly follows from number 1 and number 3. And finally, if X does not exist, then X cannot be thought about. So we get all of our bizarre conclusions. Now the first question when we're looking at an argument is, and I think I just wanted to do that to make the logic a little bit clearer, because it's really the original reconstruction that we're looking at, because that was a thing that was supposed to be plausible. But let's take a look at it piece by piece. And I think if we can, and you put this side by side, look at, if x can be thought about, then it is possible that it exists. Well, if P, then Q. Let's leave it at that, and we see what P being x can be thought about, Q being it's possible that x exists. And then we have the next premise was, if x does not exist, let's look at the second line under 2, if x does not exist, then it is not possible that x exists, which is, let's say x exists as R, so if not R, then it's possible that x exists as Q, then not Q. So notice from 2, 3 is supposed to follow, therefore, the 3 little dots meaning therefore, if Q, then R. And I give you an annotation, that thing in parentheses is explaining how we got that. It comes from number 2 by something called contraposition, which we'll take a look at a second. It actually is a logical inference, and we'll see why that's a good logical inference. Now, from 1 and 3, if P then Q is 1, if Q then R, we can conclude if P then R, 1 and 3 by hypothetical syllogism. That's one of our valid inferences, as is contraposition, by the way. And 4, if we contrapose it again, we end up with 5. If not R, then not P. If X doesn't exist, then X can't be thought about. So it looks, therefore, anything that doesn't exist can't be thought about. So it looks like this argument is perfectly valid. Now, does that mean that we have to accept it and we're done? Doesn't make it, we can't explain anything else? No, it just means it's valid. But some people might still be worried about the validity. So let's take a look at that contraposition for a second to make sure that we understand the inference, and we understand whether, in fact, the conclusion, that is 3, really follows from number 2.